Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
We're going to start the programme today by talking about school funding in England. It's a massive issue for you if you've got children at primary school or secondary school, and it would appear that it's tighter than ever, than any time over the last 30 years, in fact. That's the view of the independent watchdog, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in a new report out today. It's looked at education funding over the last 3 decades and predicts significant cuts in pupil spending. Further education, sixth forms and colleges have suffered the most. So what are the numbers? Well, according to the IFS, spending per pupil is set to fall by 6.5% by 2019-20. That's the biggest drop in more than 30 years. In recent times, the big winner has been early years education. £2.3 billion was spent on this in 2015, when back in 1990 there was virtually nothing. While pupil funding will have risen by 70% by 2020. In further education and sixth forms, it hasn't gone up at all since 1990. There are a lot of figures here. We're going to talk about it and hopefully you'll be able to absorb it a little more when we do. The predicted funding cuts have come as a concern to teaching unions who were worried about potentially larger class sizes, schools having to beg parents for cash donations and further education course options being cut. It comes as the government rolls out a new funding formula to try and make it fairer for schools in more deprived or rural areas. In a moment, we'll ask what the latest figures mean for teachers, parents, pupils and politicians. But first, let's have a look at those changes in more detail. Let's talk to Jo Yerke. Jo is mum to 2 primary school children and she has founded Fair Funding for All Schools, which campaigns for more education funding across the board. Also with us, Adrian Neeshaw. He's the head teacher at Carlton Bolling College in West Yorkshire. He says it's hard work balancing his budget. Conservative MP Neil Carmichael is here. He's also the chair of the Education Select Committee. And we've got Luke Zibieta, who wrote the report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Right, Jo, first of all, what are you seeing an impact on your children's primary school already?
Yes, absolutely. We founded this new national parent campaign because parents are very unhappy that the government isn't keeping to the promises they made to parents.
What kind of impacts are you seeing?
Well, in the areas where I am, we're seeing class sizes increase. And
From what to what?
Well, the class sizes are at the highest level in a decade.
It's not supposed to be over 30 in state schools.
Yeah, and it is in many of our schools, and as parents that's unacceptable. I don't think any parent wants to see class sizes increasing. I think if anything, parents want to see class sizes decreasing. But the point about the report that's out today is that it confirms what a lot of people are saying, parents now included, that per pupil funding is being cut. We're seeing the biggest cuts to our schools for 30 years, but the government is in denial about this, and in this context they are also introducing this new fair funding formula, which we agree with the principle of. We support the idea of a new national funding formula. We agree with the need to address historical injustice, but we don't think that what's proposed will provide justice to anyone because it's in the context of a pot that is already too small to sustain our schools.
Adrian, good morning. As a head teacher, tell us about the kind of constraints you feel you're facing. How is it impacting your children's education?
Well, it's not really impacting too much here, but it is a challenging situation. It has been for a good few years now. We've had various cost pressures. National insurance contributions gone up, pension contributions gone up, introduction of living wage, apprenticeship levy, all laudable things, but they've had pressures on the school. So we've had to, over the last 2 to 3 years, do various things to make sure can maintain our class size. So in maths and English, we've got an average class size of 15. We'll retain that. But to do that, we've had to have about 20 or 30 restructured. So staff in areas which are deemed non-critical have had to go, unfortunately.
What's a non-critical area? Sorry to interrupt. What's a non-critical area, briefly?
So administration. So at one time we had about 14 people in the admin team, and now we're down to about 6 or 7. Okay. So for me, we have the resources where it brings the results for the students, which are in the classroom. So the last area I would go to compromise would be increasing class sizes.
OK, let me bring in Luke then, because you wrote this report for the Institute for Fiscal Studies. It's independent, you've no axe to grind. Some things appear to be contradictory. Maybe you can explain them. You say funding per pupil is going to fall 6.5% by 2020. Yep. The government says spending is higher in real terms by 70%.
Well, to start with, they're both true.
OK.
So the cuts to school spending that will come over the next few years come on the back of a very significant increase in school spending over the 2000s and a bit of an increase in the last Parliament. So we're still going to be in a situation in 2020 while spending per head is about 70% higher than it was in, say, 1990. Yeah. But schools are making the first real terms cuts they've had to make in about 20 years. So the last time we made a cut of this size was about in the mid-1990s. So I imagine there are very few head teachers around today who were then going about trying to find cuts in their budgets.
So what's falling is the amount of money being spent per pupil. Yeah. Because the numbers of children is going up. Is that fair?
Yes. So the numbers of children are going up by about an extra 7% pupils by 2020 as compared with 2015. The spending per pupil that goes into the classroom will be frozen in cash terms, so sort of if it's £5,000, it'll still be £5,000 per pupil in 2020, but they're not providing extra money for the costs of inflation. So the extra national insurance contributions, the extra pension contributions, the extra cost of teacher pay, that money isn't going to schools.
Neil Carmichael, you're a Conservative MP. Do you accept that budgets are becoming more stretched for primary school pupils and secondary school pupils?
Well, overall, the budgets are tight because, of course, we've got a deficit of £60 billion each year to deal with. So it is certainly true that no big promises can be made to expand the entire budget. But within the budget, I do think we need to be more sensible about the way in which we allocate money. And I think that there are two areas which have done quite well. One, obviously, is early years. That, in comparison to the 1990s, is hugely different and better.
But why would you, sorry to interrupt, Mr Carmichael, as a Conservative MP and chair of the Education Select Committee, why would you want to see funding per pupil falling by 2020?
Well, we don't.
Then you could make different choices. You don't have to spend 50 billion on HS2 or foreign aid or whatever.
Well, obviously there's lots of different choices we could make.
So why make that choice?
And obviously, ultimately, what we do need to do is spend more on education. I'll tell you why. One reason is that we have a serious shortage of skills in our economy. If we leave the European Union, which we intend to do,
so it seems
then we are
utterly bizarre, doesn't it?
Well, I think the key thing is making sure that we spend the money on the right areas. Now, I could think of a few. I've talked about already early years, but let's look at the free school situation, for example. The NAO, another leading organisation, has pointed out that we're spending a huge amount of money on building new schools, sometimes, according to the NAO, in the wrong place. So we need to think about that. So that's about making sure the money that we do have, we spend well. And that's clearly a thrust of the Education Select Committee. But more important still is the need to deal with two big challenges. One is the long tail of underachievement in our primary school sector, as identified by Sir Michael Wiltshire back in 2013.
And it's
exactly, and it is still a serious problem. So we do have to think very carefully what we're doing in our primary schools.
So that was identified by him last year.
Yes, it was.
You've been in power now for how long? Since 2010?
Absolutely.
So it's not a good idea to see spending per pupil fall by 6.5%,
well, as Luke has
is
pointed
it?
out, we've actually increased expenditure pretty well since...
Yeah, but the numbers of pupils have gone up.
Absolutely.
So
and
do the maths.
But
Sorry, I don't mean to be rude.
No, you're being absolutely right. That's why, in the long term, we've got to increase expenditure on education.
Right. Is Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, going to do that in the budget which is coming up?
I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon because, as I've already said, we've got a £60 billion deficit. But the warning sign is actually, what are we going to do when we leave the European Union and we need to have the skills that we haven't had in the past? Because actually what we've done in the last 30-odd years is getting the skills, got to get the skills from abroad.
Jo,
Yeah,
parent,
like
2 children
say,
in primary school.
Yeah,
Talk to Conservative
well, it's a bit
MP.
late for Neil to say that you can't make promises to put more money in because you already made those promises. You made them in your manifesto. You made a promise to protect per pupil funding.
Yes, we did.
And you made a promise to introduce a new national funding formula.
Yes, we did.
To address the chronic
And we've done
underfunding in
both.
some of our areas. Well, the report out today would suggest you haven't. And I think that you made those promises. You must have thought that you would need to provide the funds to be able to deliver them. And as parents, what we're saying is, please would you now do that? Because we're not happy with the impact of the cuts to our schools.
I think one of the things that Luke's report may have emphasised, because I haven't read the whole of it, but we've got inflation now, and that is having a huge impact on our school budgets, because as Adrian pointed out in his piece, he's having to think about pensions, he's having to think about other costs, like, for example, the living wage. Now, all of these are feeding into the system, so we do have to recalibrate it.
All introduced by a Conservative government.
Absolutely.
So you knew that was coming down the line.
Yeah,
so
who wants to cement in poverty? The living wage is an excellent idea and quite right too.
No one's arguing against the living wage, I don't think.
No, good.
But you knew that was coming, so therefore you have to address that with the funding for schools in England, surely.
Well, what I'm saying is that I don't think that the next budget, and it's coming soon, is going to be particularly good news if we're asking for a big increase in the total budget. What I do think is that in the medium term or the long term, we certainly should be campaigning for that, and I am, as a Conservative Member of Parliament. But whilst we are talking about the budget that we've got to make sure that the money goes to the right places. And that's actually something which Jo was really alluding to earlier when she was talking about the new fairer funding system, because, of course, that is actually about making sure pupils, wherever they are, get a fair slice of the cake. And I think there are some aspects about that new formula funding system which we do need to test.
OK, I'm going to leave it there. I know you've all got loads more to say, and we will definitely return to this issue. Do not worry about that. Thank you so much for coming on the programme. Neil Carmichael, he's a Conservative MP. Thank you. He's also chair of the Education Select Committee. Luke Zibieta, who wrote the report for the IFS. Jo Yerke, mum of 2 primary school children. And thanks for your time as well as a head teacher, Adrian Neeshaw. Thank you in West Yorkshire.
Schools in England are facing their biggest cuts in funding for 20 years. The Institute for Fiscal Studies says despite money from central government being frozen until 2020, inflation means that amounts to a real terms cut of 6.5% per pupil. The Department for Education says school funding is at its highest level on record, and it's also planning a shake-up in the way money is shared out across schools in England. Our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, has the story.
Market towns like Nantwich don't see many demos. This morning, hundreds turned out in the cold.
Absolutely ridiculous.
Parents wanting a better funding deal for schools.
The funding model isn't fair. Why should children in other areas of Britain receive more funding than they do here?
I'm on benefits. I'm a single parent with 3 children, and without the schools, they wouldn't have those opportunities.
I think the fact that they would have things cut like the arts and music and things that will make a well-rounded education, to have teachers that maybe it's not their subject that's going to have to teach kind of mainstream subjects as well. It's just really shocking in this day and age that they won't have the choices.
There's a strong sense of injustice amongst the parents here. It's in an area that was already one of the lowest funded in England. They're now facing getting even less cash under this new deal.
We're using subject terminology, present participle.
They have to pass the same exams, but there's less money here for each pupil than most of England. That will get a little worse under government plans. The bills the school has to pay are going up. Altogether, it means losing £450,000, the equivalent of 11 teaching staff.
performance, music, drama, PE, all these subjects, creativity will be lost.
Should you have the same money as an inner city where there are lots of children with difficulties and problems?
Where we are at the moment is in Crewe, a very deprived area with many children with English as an additional language, with lots of high needs children and lots of issues that you would find in an inner city school.
You guys were lucky, you got some expert tuition.
But do the winners under the new deal feel lucky? The other end of England in Yeovil, teachers' pay is similar. Somerset would get a bigger share, but still faces the same rising bills.
We welcome any additional funding that we are awarded for our students. Our major concern is that the amount that is being proposed is minor compared to the gaps that we face against many areas in the country already. It's an absolute drop in the ocean.
And schools aren't used to tearing strips off their budget. They've had increases for 2 decades. Ministers argue funding is at record levels. But when money is tight, changes are controversial. Brown and Jeffries, BBC News.